At exactly noon, when the sun stood high enough to erase mercy from the ground, the villagers saw it. Everyone else had a shadow. Long or short, sharp or trembling, every living thing was anchored to the earth by darkness. Every tree, every child, every animal panting under the heat. Everyone, except her. She stood alone in the open clearing, barefoot on the baked red soil, the sun pouring over her shoulders without resistance. The light struck her body, her arms, her face, yet nothing followed her feet. No dark shape clung to her. No outline betrayed her presence. The ground beneath her remained violently bright, untouched. A basket slipped from someone's hands. A child stopped breathing mid-laugh. An elder whispered a prayer he had not spoken since his youth. At noon, shadows were unavoidable. They were proof of life. Proof that the world still obeyed its rules. But the girl stood there calmly, her eyes lowered, her hands folded, as if she already knew what the sun would reveal, and had accepted it long ago. No wind moved. No bird cried. And in that unbearable silence, a single thought spread through the crowd, heavier than fear. If a person has no shadow at noon, what, then, has she given up to the light? By the time the sun climbed past the acacia trees and settled into its merciless position overhead, the village had already found its rhythm. Midday was not a time for questions. It was a time for routine. Women moved slowly between clay huts, their footsteps steady on the packed red earth, balancing bowls of grain or water with the ease of repetition learned over lifetimes. Mortars thudded softly as maize was ground into flour, the sound dull and patient, like a heartbeat beneath the heat. Smoke rose lazily from cooking fires, carrying the smell of boiling roots and bitter leaves into the still air. Children, stripped of their morning energy, sat in the shade where walls leaned just enough to offer relief. They traced shapes in the dust with sticks, argued quietly, then laughed again as if nothing in the world could interrupt the safety of this hour. Goats huddled together near fences, their sides rising and falling, tongues hanging loose. Even the chickens stopped wandering, settling into uneasy stillness beneath overturned baskets. The elders gathered where they always did, under the wide, scarred tree at the edge of the clearing. They spoke of rain that had not come, of harvests past, of stories everyone knew so well they no longer needed endings. One man repaired a cracked sandal with shaking fingers. Another chewed slowly on a piece of sugarcane, eyes half closed, listening more to memory than to sound. Nothing here was dramatic. Nothing demanded attention. This was the hour when the village revealed itself as it truly was, human, ordinary, worn smooth by time. The sun ruled everything at noon. It decided where people walked, where they rested, how long they spoke. Shadows became narrow and sharp, pinned directly beneath bodies like dark footprints that refused to wander. There was comfort in that certainty. Light above, darkness below. Cause and effect. Presence and proof. It had always been this way. When the heat grew too heavy, people retreated without thinking. A pot was moved closer to the wall. A child was pulled into deeper shade. Life adjusted itself, instinctively, without complaint. Even silence had a place here, settling gently over the village like dust. No one expected mystery in moments like this. If something strange existed, it belonged to the night, to dreams, to stories told beside dying fires, to whispers carried by the wind after sunset. Daylight was honest. Daylight exposed everything it touched. That belief had shaped the village for generations. At noon, lies burned away. Secrets shrank. Spirits hid. So when people gathered in the clearing during this hour, they did so with a quiet confidence that nothing unseen could stand among them. Noon was protection. Noon was truth. The ground itself seemed to agree. Cracked and dry, it reflected the sun back upward, punishing anyone foolish enough to linger too long without purpose. Sweat traced familiar paths down backs and necks. Time slowed, stretching thin, but it remained predictable. This was the world as it should be. And in that world, where routines held, where light obeyed its ancient laws, where shadows proved existence, there was no room for exceptions. No room for questions. No room for a girl who did not belong to the sun the way everyone else did. Yet she moved through this ordinary hour like a quiet note out of tune, soft enough to be ignored at first, but impossible to forget once heard. And though no one spoke it aloud, the village felt it then, deep in its bones. If something could break the rules of noon, It had been hiding for a very long time. They began to notice her not because she demanded attention, but because she never did. She appeared in the village as if she had always been there, woven quietly into the spaces between routines. In the early mornings, she carried water from the river alongside the other girls, her steps light, her balance careful. She greeted everyone with the same soft nod, the same calm eyes that never lingered too long on any face. If someone dropped a bundle, she bent to lift it. If a child cried, she knelt without being asked. No one could remember when she had first arrived. She lived in a small hut at the far edge of the village, where the land sloped slightly downward and the shadows stretched longer in the afternoon. The hut was clean but sparse, no decorations, no charms hanging from the door, no signs of wealth or desperation. It looked like a place meant only for sleeping, not for living loudly. People tried, gently at first, to learn about her. Where was her family? Who had taught her such quiet manners? Why did she never join the others when the sun reached its highest point? She answered some questions with polite simplicity. She had learned to work where she was needed. She was grateful for the food she received. She preferred being alone. Other questions she met with silence, or with a faint smile that closed the door without locking it. There was nothing rude about her refusal. That, perhaps, was what unsettled them most. Children liked her immediately. They followed her in the mornings, copying the way she walked, the way she balanced baskets on her head without using her hands. She never raised her voice at them. When they asked her to tell stories, she told only small ones, about rivers that remembered every footstep, or birds that refused to fly at noon. The stories never had clear endings. The elders watched her longer. They noticed how she positioned herself as the day changed. In the mornings and late afternoons, she moved freely, crossing open spaces without hesitation. But as the sun climbed, her paths grew narrower. She walked closer to walls. She paused beneath trees even when the shade was thin and shifting. When the clearing filled at midday, she was never at its center. If she had to cross it, she waited. Sometimes she turned back entirely, choosing a longer path that hugged the huts, even if it meant carrying a heavy load twice as far. When someone called out to her from the open ground at noon, she pretended not to hear. Once, an old woman laughed and asked, half joking, if the sun frightened her. The girl lowered her eyes and said only, "The sun sees too much." That answer lingered in the air long after she had gone. She never spoke of fear. Never spoke of spirits or curses. Never claimed to be different. And yet, difference clung to her like a second skin. At night, she sat near the fires but not within their brightest circle. She listened more than she spoke. When laughter rose, she smiled. When arguments flared, she slipped away before choosing a side. If someone was sick, she brought water and leaves without being asked, then left before thanks could be given. Kindness followed her like a quiet trail. But kindness did not explain why no one had ever seen her shadow stretch across the ground. Not once. Even in the early mornings, when shadows were long and playful, hers seemed oddly careful, never fully separating from her feet, never wandering freely. And at noon, when shadows should have clung tightly, hers was simply absent. She never commented on it. Never acknowledged the glances, the pauses, the unspoken counting of steps in the dust. She behaved as if nothing were wrong. Which made the question impossible to ignore. What kind of person lives gently among others, while carrying something the light itself is not allowed to touch? At first, the village tried to explain what it was seeing. People are good at that, finding small, comfortable answers to things that disturb them. The sun was too bright that day. The ground was uneven. Someone had simply looked away at the wrong moment. Shadows could be tricky, especially at noon. So they watched again. A man mending nets near the clearing noticed how the girl stopped at the edge of the open ground, hesitating as if measuring the distance with her eyes. When another woman called her name from the center, she smiled politely but did not step forward. Instead, she set her basket down and waited in the thin shade of a wall until someone else came to her. That evening, the man mentioned it casually, as if it meant nothing. Others nodded. They had seen the same thing. The next day, a child decided to test it. He followed her during the hottest hour, darting from shade to shade like a lizard, careful not to be seen. When she paused beneath a narrow strip of shadow, he stepped into the open behind her and stared at the ground. There was his shadow. Small, clear, pinned beneath his feet. There was hers. Or rather, there wasn't. The boy felt his chest tighten. He laughed once, too loudly, then ran home without telling anyone what he had seen. By nightfall, 3 other children were whispering the same story to each other, their voices thin with excitement and fear. Still, no one confronted her. Instead, the village began to arrange itself around the mystery. People noticed how objects seemed to move slightly when she passed. Bowls shifted into shade, stools were placed closer to walls. Not by her request. By instinct. As if something in her presence made others uncomfortable with open light. A woman selling dried fish swore that when the girl stood near her stall at noon, the ground felt colder. Another claimed the air grew strangely heavy, though nothing visible changed. When asked what exactly she meant, the woman shrugged. "It is only a feeling," she said. "But feelings are not nothing." Questions were asked carefully, disguised as kindness. "Why don't you rest with us in the clearing? Why do you always leave before the sun is highest? Why do you walk so far when there is a shorter path?" The girl answered without answering. "The shade is quieter," she said once. "I move better along the edges," she said another time. "There are places the sun does not need me to be." Each response settled the moment, and opened a larger space of unease behind it. An elder finally spoke to her directly. He had lived long enough to know when silence was becoming dangerous. At midday, he found her near her hut, sitting where the roof cast a careful shadow over her feet. He asked her where she came from. She said, "From where I was needed." He asked her what she carried that made her avoid the sun. She looked at her hands for a long time before answering. "I carry what cannot be seen safely," she said. The elder felt a chill that had nothing to do with the heat. Rumors began to shift shape. They grew sharper, less forgiving. Some said she had angered a spirit and lost her shadow as payment. Others whispered that she had never been born fully human. A few insisted that her shadow followed her at night, walking where she could not, doing things she refused to speak of. And yet, no harm followed her. Crops did not fail because of her. Children did not fall sick. Fires did not burn out of control. If anything, misfortune seemed to soften in places she had been, as if something unseen had already passed through and taken the worst of it away. That contradiction troubled the village more than any curse could have. Because if she was dangerous, why was she gentle? If she was hiding something dark, why did it feel like protection rather than threat? By the end of the week, the question had changed. No longer, what is wrong with her? But instead, what is she keeping from the sun, and who is it meant to protect? The moment the truth stopped being avoidable came without ceremony. It happened on a day when the heat pressed down harder than usual, when even the elders abandoned their debates and retreated into silence. The sun climbed, relentless, and the clearing filled as it always did, people gathering to exchange goods before the worst of the afternoon drove them apart. The girl arrived carrying a bundle of firewood, her steps careful, her eyes already searching for the nearest line of shade. This time, she misjudged it. A cloud shifted, thin, harmless-looking, and for a breath of a moment, the light changed. The shadow she relied on slid away from her feet, stretching just far enough to leave her exposed in the center of the clearing. Someone gasped. She stopped walking. For the first time since anyone could remember, she did not move toward shelter. She did not turn back. She stood exactly where she was, the sun pouring over her like a judgment. Every shadow around her sharpened. People leaned forward, drawn by something they did not want to see but could not look away from. The ground beneath her feet glowed bare and empty, an island of light surrounded by proof. No shadow followed her. A woman dropped her basket. Fish scattered across the dirt, flashing silver. No one bent to pick them up. The girl closed her eyes. A murmur rippled through the crowd, then grew, layer by layer, into something heavier. Fear does not arrive all at once. It gathers courage from itself. "She truly has none," someone whispered. "She is standing in full sun," another said, as if stating it again might make it false. An elder stepped forward, staff trembling in his hand. He did not accuse her. Not yet. But his voice carried the weight of every story the village had ever told itself about light and darkness. "Step aside," he said. Stand where we can see clearly. The girl opened her eyes. For a moment, something flickered there, pain, perhaps, or resignation. She shook her head slowly. I cannot, she said. That answer struck harder than any confession. People backed away. A few crossed themselves with old gestures meant to confuse wandering spirits. Children were pulled behind their mother's legs. The space around the girl widened until she stood alone. The clearing suddenly too large. Why? The elder asked. She looked at the ground, then at the sky, as if measuring the distance between them. Because if I stay here, she said softly, the sun will finish what it has been trying to do. No one understood what she meant. But the air changed. The heat grew sharp, unnatural, pressing against skin like a warning. A low ringing filled some people's ears. Dogs began to whine and crawl into shade, tails tucked. The girl swayed. Instinct broke through fear. A young woman rushed forward, grabbing her arm to pull her toward the wall. The moment skin touched skin, the girl cried out, not in pain, but in effort. The sun flared brighter, as if offended. The ground shimmered. For a split second, something dark moved beneath the light, not a shadow but a shape struggling to remain hidden. The young woman stumbled back, gasping. What was that? She screamed. The girl wrenched herself free and stumbled into the narrow strip of shade beside a hut. The moment her feet crossed into darkness, the pressure lifted. The sun settled. The ringing stopped. Silence crashed down. Everyone had seen it. Not a shadow, but something that wanted to become one. That night, the village did not gather as usual. Doors closed early. Fires burned low. Mothers held their children tighter. The elders argued in whispers that cracked with fear. One truth had taken root, impossible to pull out. Whatever the girl was hiding from the sun was growing stronger. And soon, it would no longer be enough for her to stand at the edges. Fear does not shout at first. It whispers, passing from mouth to mouth in the dark, changing shape with every telling. By morning, the village no longer spoke of whether something was wrong with the girl. The question had shifted to how long they had allowed it to remain among them. People avoided her path. Water jars were moved when she approached. Conversations ended abruptly when she entered the space, as if her presence drained sound from the air. Even those who had once defended her kindness now watched her with cautious eyes, measuring distance, counting the steps between shade and sun. The elders met before noon. They sat in a tight circle beneath the old tree, their shadows short and obedient beneath them. What they discussed did not need to be spoken loudly. The signs were clear. Something unseen had revealed itself. And in stories older than memory, unseen things did not remain harmless for long. She has broken a law of the world, one elder said. No, another replied. She is holding something that has. That distinction did not bring comfort. By midday, a decision had been made, not declared but felt. The girl was no longer simply different. She was a risk. When she came to the well that afternoon, the space around it emptied. A woman she had helped many times before pulled her child close and turned away. The girl noticed. Of course she did. But she said nothing. She lowered her bucket, drew her water, and stepped back into the narrow shade cast by the well's stone wall. Only then did she drink. Children no longer followed her. They watched from doorways instead, eyes wide, curiosity sharpened by fear. One boy whispered that if you stared at her feet at noon, you could feel something looking back. The girl stopped telling stories. At night, she no longer sat near the fires. She ate alone, her back against her hut, where darkness pooled more deeply. The village had not banished her, but it had begun to erase her. That was when the signs grew worse. A goat broke its leg where the ground had been solid. A pot cracked without heat. A bird fell from the sky at noon, its shadow fluttering wildly before disappearing altogether. Small things. Easy to dismiss. Impossible to ignore when placed together. Each incident occurred near places the girl had passed. The elders called her before them on the third day. They chose noon on purpose. She arrived slowly, walking the edge of the clearing, never stepping fully into the open. Her face was calm, but her hands trembled. She stood where the shadow of the great tree just touched her toes, as if she had measured the limit precisely. "You must tell us what you carry," the eldest said, "or you must leave." A murmur of agreement moved through the gathered crowd. The girl closed her eyes. "If I leave," she said, "it will follow me." "And if you stay?" someone demanded. She opened her eyes then, and for the first time, fear lived openly in them. "Then I can keep it small." The words landed heavily. "What is it?" the elder pressed. She shook her head. "If I name it in the sun," she said, "it will learn it is seen." That answer ignited anger. Some shouted that she was playing with spirits. Others accused her of choosing the village as a hiding place. A man stepped forward, voice shaking with rage and terror. "You think you can decide for all of us?" he shouted. "You think your silence protects us?" The girl met his gaze. "I know it does," she said. That certainty frightened them more than any confession. The argument fractured the village. Some demanded she be driven out before noon returned. Others insisted she be bound and forced into the light so the truth could be revealed and destroyed. All the while, the sun climbed higher. The girl backed deeper into shadow, breath shallow, eyes never leaving the sky. Because she could feel it now, stretching, testing, learning. The thing beneath her feet no longer wanted to hide. And the village had given it exactly what it needed: attention. The breaking point came faster than anyone expected. It arrived not with fire or screams, but with a child. Just before noon, when the sun hovered like a blade poised to fall, a shout tore through the village. A small boy had collapsed near the outer path, far from the safety of walls and trees. His mother ran first, screaming his name, but stopped short when she reached him. The ground beneath the boy was wrong. His shadow twisted unnaturally, stretched too far, bending away from his body as if pulled by an invisible hand. The boy's chest rose in shallow, panicked bursts. His eyes were wide, fixed on something no one else could see. The elders arrived moments later. So did the girl. She had run, truly run, for the first time, her feet striking the earth without care for the sun. When she reached the boy, she dropped to her knees beside him, fully exposed in the open light. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. "No!" someone shouted. "Get her out of the sun!" But she didn't move. Instead, she placed her hands flat on the ground, one on either side of the boy's warped shadow. Her body trembled violently. Sweat poured down her face, not from heat alone, but from effort. The air thickened. The boy screamed. His shadow lifted from the earth like a living thing, writhing, resisting, stretching toward the girl's feet as if recognizing a familiar path. The sun flared harshly, burning white. People shielded their eyes. The girl cried out, not in pain, but in command. "Stay," she whispered. The word cut through the noise like a blade through cloth. For a heartbeat, everything froze. The shadow hesitated, pulled between the child and the girl. Then, slowly, unwillingly, it began to shrink, folding back toward the boy's body like a wounded animal retreating. The boy collapsed into unconsciousness. The moment his shadow settled where it belonged, the girl screamed and fell backward, her body convulsing as if struck. Something dark burst outward beneath her, no longer hidden, no longer contained. Not a shadow. A hunger. It rippled across the ground, warping every shadow it touched, pulling them toward her like roots reaching for water. People fell back in terror. The elders shouted for her to move, to stand, to run. She didn't. Instead, she dragged herself, inch by inch, toward the narrow strip of shade cast by a nearby hut. Every movement looked impossible. Each time she shifted, the darkness surged, fighting to remain in the light. When her feet finally crossed into shadow, the thing recoiled violently, snapping back beneath her like a leash pulled tight. The sun dimmed. The world exhaled. Silence fell so suddenly it hurt. The villagers stared, breathing hard, hearts pounding. They had seen it now, not rumor, not imagination. Proof. The girl lay curled on her side, shaking, her face pressed to the dirt. The elder who had questioned her earlier approached slowly, reverently, as one approaches something sacred and dangerous. "You are not its source," he said, realization breaking his voice. She shook her head weakly. "It followed me once," she whispered. "I learned how to hold it." "Why?" he asked. Why carry it at all? She closed her eyes, tears cutting clean lines through the dust on her cheeks. Because if I let it go, she said, it would look for softer ground. The weight of that truth settled over them. The child stirred, breathing evenly now. His mother wept, clutching him to her chest. The girl did not look at them. She stared instead at the edge of the shadow, measuring it, guarding it, already preparing for the next noon. Because what they had witnessed was not an ending. It was a warning. And for the first time, the village understood. The girl was not hiding from the sun. She was standing between it, and something far worse. They did not wait for noon this time. At dawn, when the light was still gentle and forgiving, the elders gathered again, this time at the edge of the girl's hut, where shadows still stretched long and honest. No one shouted. No one accused. The fear that remained had changed shape. It had become something heavier, quieter. Respect. The girl sat on the ground before them, exhausted. Dark circles bruised the skin beneath her eyes. She had not slept. None of them had. You must tell us everything, the eldest said, not as a command, but as a plea. We have seen enough to know this cannot remain half-spoken. The girl nodded slowly. When I was younger, she began, my village believed shadows were only absence. They were wrong. She told them of a place far from here, where the sun burned longer and harder than it did now. A place where people worked until their shadows thinned and clung too tightly to their feet. Where grief, unspoken and piled high, began to sink into the ground. Some pain does not leave, she said. It waits. She explained that shadows remember. They absorb what people refuse to face: fear, violence, hunger, rage. Most of the time, the sun keeps those things flat and harmless, pressed thin against the earth. But sometimes, when pain is fed for too long, a shadow grows depth. It learns to lift itself. The elders listened in silence as she spoke of the day it happened, when the shadows in her village rose at noon, twisting, tearing free from their owners. People ran from themselves. Some were swallowed by the very darkness they had carried for years. I survived, she said softly. Not because I was strong. Because one of them chose me. The shadow that followed her was not hers. It was a gathering, a knot of many pains, many lives, many endings. It attached itself to her because she did not fight it. Because she saw it. And once it chose me, she said, I learned its rules. The sun weakened it. Attention fed it. Fear made it stretch. But shade, true shade, chosen shade, bound it. Kept it small. Kept it listening. So I walk the edges, she said. I hide my shadow at noon, because if the sun finishes burning it away, it will scatter. And if it scatters, it will root itself in others. That was the truth. She was not cursed. She was carrying a wound the world had refused to hold. The elder's hands trembled. All this time, he said, you stayed so it would not choose us. She nodded. This place is gentle, she said. It does not deserve what follows me. A long silence followed. Not the fearful kind, but the kind that comes after understanding settles in the body. What happens to you? Someone finally asked. The girl looked toward the horizon, where the sun was climbing again. One day, she said, I will not be strong enough to hold it. Or I will grow tired. Or I will choose rest. And then, the elder asked. Then I will step fully into the sun, she said. And it will end with me. No one spoke. Because now they understood the final truth. The girl did not lack a shadow. She carried too many. And every day at noon, when the sun was most honest and most cruel, she chose to stand just far enough into the light to keep everyone else safe. Not because she was bound to, but because she loved people who would never fully know what she held beneath her feet. From that day on, the village learned how to live with what could not be seen. No drums announced the change. No ceremony marked it. But the rhythm of the place shifted, quietly, the way land does after a long drought finally breaks. At noon, people began to move differently. They paid attention to where shadows fell. Not with fear, but with care. Children were taught not only to seek shade, but to respect it. Elders stopped saying that darkness was empty. They said instead, some things rest there. The girl was no longer avoided. She was never celebrated either. That she had asked for herself. Praise, she said, made the thing beneath her feet restless. So the village honored her in smaller ways. Someone always made sure there was shade where she needed to walk. A stool was placed just close enough to the wall. A path was cleared along the edges of the clearing, where light softened before it sharpened. At noon, no one asked her to cross open ground. She stayed. Not trapped. Not forced. Staying became a shared act. When she grew tired, others stood nearby, not touching, not intruding, just close enough that the world felt less alone. When her hands shook, someone quietly took the heavier work from her. No words were exchanged. Understanding did not need them anymore. The children returned first. They learned where to sit so their shadows overlapped gently with hers in the mornings and evenings. They learned that silence could be kind. That questions did not always deserve answers. That bravery did not always look like standing in the light. Sometimes, at dusk, the girl told them a new kind of story. Stories about people who carried storms inside them so others could sleep through the night. Stories about ground that remembered footsteps long after travelers were gone. Stories without heroes, only choices. And when the children asked why her shadow never played like theirs, she smiled and said, "Because it is busy." Years passed. The thing beneath her feet never disappeared. But it did not grow. At noon, the sun still pressed down hard. Shadows still clung close. The world remained dangerous in the quiet ways it always had been. But the village endured. And when travelers passed through and noticed how carefully the people walked at midday, how no one laughed too loudly in the open light, they sometimes asked what the village feared. The elders answered, "Nothing." And that was true. They did not fear the dark. They did not fear the sun. They did not fear the girl. They understood now that some people are born into fire, some into water, and some into the narrow space between, where standing still is the only way to keep the world from breaking. On the day the girl finally left, there was no alarm. She walked at dawn, when shadows were long and honest. She did not say where she was going. She did not need to. The villagers watched her until she became small against the horizon, her shadow stretching behind her, not thin, not twisted, but calm. For the first time, it followed her freely. And long after she was gone, when the sun reached its highest point and the ground burned bright and bare, the village remembered her lesson. That light is not always kind. That darkness is not always cruel. And that the greatest acts of love are often performed in silence, by those who choose to stand at the edge of the sun, carrying what the world is not brave enough to face.